All right, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking about a tool that I wrote called ProbeSpy that helps in analysis of directed probe request data being sent by unassociated Wi-Fi client devices, and helps you get some potentially useful information that you can use to target people, or I don't know, maybe it'll help on your assessments. Maybe it'll just kind of help give you an idea of the type of information that your device may be sending out that you might not be aware of and how it's useful. All right, so what are we talking about? We're talking about wireless probe requests, what they are, when they're sent, what they can tell us, and how we can harness their power. So just to give a little primer on 802.11 probe requests, as I said, they're packets that are sent by unassociated client devices when they're attempting to locate a network that they have in their network config that they think they should connect to. So the information included in these packets are the MAC address of the sending radio, the sending radio's capabilities, the SSID as an optional field, and so just given that those little pieces of information, what can we determine about the device? So the sending radio address field, generally speaking, would be the burnt-in MAC address of the device. So if it was the case that the device wasn't attempting to obfuscate its own MAC address, we would be able to determine that. Since about iOS 8, and I know there are a handful of other operating systems that have done this as well, there have been moves to randomize MAC addresses as they are displayed in probe requests, because the MAC address in the probe request doesn't actually need to be the burnt-in MAC address of the device. You only need to use that MAC address once you go to associate. So there are some devices that attempt to disconnect the burnt-in MAC address from the MAC address that's implanted in the probe request. But certainly for some devices, you can determine that this is the burnt-in MAC address, because you can find them sending from the same MAC address many different directed probe requests to many different networks. Additionally, we have the sending radio capabilities. This will include, the frequencies that the radio will be able to send and receive on, modulation and encryption schemes that it can support, all sorts of other various features that you can have on Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi Direct and other stuff like that. You might think that you'd be able to determine some sort of device fingerprinting using this, because I'm not sure how many octets, but there are a lot of octets that define all of these different features. But recently, within the past couple of months, there was a paper, you can see the link down there to the PDF for it, released by the U.S. Naval Research Academy, that determined that for many devices, those identifying features will change on a regular basis. So it's not really a useful feature for any of the purposes that we're looking for. And finally, we have the SSID field. Now, as I said, the SSID field is optional. A directed probe request will include the actual SSID value in addition to the length of the SSID value as a kind of checksum, or the SSID field can be left blank or null, and that'll designate a broadcast probe request, where essentially the client is prompting any access points that receive the packet to advertise themselves to it, so it can determine whether or not it wants to connect to that device. So SSIDs are not designed to be unique. They're mutable. I'm sure we've all seen many examples of, duplicate SSIDs across multiple deployments, either at a single corporate site or across, multiple franchises, or even, like every Linksys that you get at least a while ago, having Linksys as its SSID. But there's definitely a possibility that your SSID could be unique to you in the world. IEEE spec for SSIDs allows for 32 printable ASCII characters, so 32 to the 95th is an awful lot of different character possibilities. So I don't expect to find too many people using fully randomized SSIDs, because that would be kind of ridiculous, but it's certainly possible. All right, so given this information, what can we do? We can identify the sending, or the MAC address of the sending radio, potentially, if they're not attempting to randomize the MAC address. We can identify directed probe requests, or we can identify the SSIDs that a device is attempting to connect to via the directed probe requests. And for devices that are not changing their MAC address, we can identify a list of networks that that device is attempting to connect to. But can we do more with this? Because at this point, we're pretty much on an island. We have a device as identified by the MAC address and a handful of networks that it's connected to. But that might not really give us a whole lot of information about the device or the person if we don't know anything else about them. So if you look here, this is a sample of a directed probe request that I've collected from out in the wild. And if you look at it, you can see a handful of examples of, corporate guest networks. There's an IHOP Wireless, Kroger, McDonald's, National Coney Island, etc. So, based on those, we might be able to determine something about where this person goes to eat, or where they go to buy their groceries, or other information like that. Additionally, up here, the second one, you can see it's named I Love Bamboo, Madison Heights. Now, if I was in an area and I was, attempting to determine something about these places, I might be able to identify that that was a specific location. And I'd be willing to bet that there probably aren't too many other I Love Bamboos in any other Madison Heights around the world. So, using some Google Foo, we might be able to make some educated guesses about where that network exists. So that brings us into our next section, which is behavioral profiling by SSID, which is essentially a fancy way of me saying that I can tell you went to Taco Bell because your device is trying to connect to a Taco Bell network. So essentially, this is taking advantage of the fact that guest Wi-Fi deployments for companies are widespread and people use them frequently, or at least that's the theory. Certainly, many SSIDs are uniform across deployments. I've seen Panera Bread use Panera in all caps across many different visits to Panera. Target guest Wi-Fi as well. Hilton Hotels uses H Honors. And some other SSIDs, as I mentioned before, we might be able to make educated guesses about where they are in the world just based on the content of the SSID themselves. For example, SeaTac Free Wi-Fi is a guest deployment that's at SeaTac Airport, and Otopani Airport in Romania, I think I'm pronouncing that right, is Otopani Airport. So, just by looking at the names of the networks, we might be able to make educated guesses about what the person is doing, what kind of businesses they patronize, or at least what kind of businesses they visited, places they've been, etc. But as I'm sure you guys are well aware, and as I mentioned before, SSIDs are entirely mutable. I could set up a network with any kind of name that I wanted to and put it anywhere and try and entice people to connect to it through various means, or just, set something up at my house on a lark. Just because I have FBI surveillance van set up as my house doesn't mean that I'm an FBI surveillance van. So it would be really cool if we could get some kind of third-party verification about where these networks existed in the world. And it would be even more useful for networks that don't have names that really lend themselves very well to us finding information about them. I skipped over the slide. So this is essentially where we're at. So we can determine some behavior about the persons using some devices, because it's certainly possible that multiple people could be using a single device. We can determine businesses visited or patronized, hotels, restaurants, sometimes ISPs. That's kind of a fuzzy area because a lot of guest deployments for ISPs can be used by anybody, although they may be indicative, for instance, in the case of Xfinity Wi-Fi, where clients of Xfinity get, some sort of access to various guest deployments that they might be a customer of that company. So, yeah, is there some kind of third-party way, some kind of third party that we can query in order to determine that these networks are actually where they say they are? And this is just kind of a list of networks that I've gone through the legwork of identifying their various locations and attributes. So we could go around and try and war drive to find them ourselves. Get either like an app for your phone or whatever, or set up your laptop with Kismet and a GPS device and drive hundreds of miles around whatever area you were trying to locate networks for, and then query your own database of locations that you've identified for various networks, with your ski mask on, of course. So I think that's both cost and time prohibitive. I certainly would not have the patience to actually drive every single square block of an area where I thought people might actually be if I was attempting to try and find them. Maybe there are other organizations or people that have that kind of time budget, but I certainly don't. So it would be nice if somebody else did the legwork to actually go around and find where all these networks are. Now, some of you might be familiar with Wi-Fi positioning systems. These are essentially doing just that, taking advantage of smartphones or Google Street View cars, other devices to determine at any given point in the world, the location being determined by GPS or GLONASS or some other location service, what wireless networks are visible from that point. And you populate a giant database with all of these different data points, and then if your phone or other processing deficient or power deficient device needs to try and find out where it is, it can collect a list of the networks that are around it, submit it up to this database, and it'll kind of do a Venn diagram search of all the places in the world where these networks can be seen, and then returns a location to the device. Now, there are a handful of services that allow you to run queries on this. Skyhook Wireless is one commercial service. Google, I believe, has a commercial service for it, but they'll let you run plenty of things against it for free. I haven't hit a limit yet. Mozilla also runs one. But the limitation with these services, besides potential cost issues, which honestly I haven't investigated because of the second issue, is that they don't, well, they usually require you to query by BSSID, that is the MAC address of the access point that you can see. Optionally, you can include SSIDs and signal strength in order to kind of trim down your query even more. But usually, not only do they require BSSIDs, which we don't get from the directed probe requests, but they also usually require that you submit 2 or 3 or more in a single query in order to get back the location. And I suspect this is so that people just don't, individually sort through BSSIDs and attempt to, suck down all of the locations for various BSSIDs from their database. So it would be really nice if we had another service that would let us query by SSID or any other value that we might want to. And luckily there is. Wiggle.net is essentially a community-driven war driving database where if you happen to be, driving along in your car, there's an app on your phone that you can download, or if you have, crazy war driving setup for your car, you can do that too. You can submit the PCAPs up to Wiggle and they'll compile all of those locations together and allow you to query for, networks based on a whole bunch of different parameters. So they'll actually do it for Wi-Fi access points and cell towers, which is not useful for this talk, but it's kind of interesting in general. And again, it lets us search by a whole bunch of different query parameters. We can bound to specific latitude and longitude coordinates to search by. We can search by SSID, by portions of SSIDs, by BSSIDs, by encryption type, by first and last seen date. There's a whole bunch of different variables in there. They used to only have a free interface that capped the number of queries that you could run per day, but I asked them nicely, and they've been rolling out a beta version of a commercial API, which is fairly inexpensive. It's 1.3 cents per value returned from a given query, so it's not that expensive to run for this stuff at least. So again, Wiggle.net allows us to query by SSID, and unfortunately, because I'm kind of lazy and this whole thing was written in a bash script and I'm not a really good programmer, as far as I'm concerned, duplicates mean uncertainty. So anytime I receive more than one value for a given return, I am interpreting that as me being unable to definitively locate where this network is, at least as far as Wiggle is concerned. But certainly sometimes we get lucky. Sometimes there are very few people, who have a given network name, or only one. If we bound our search within a specific area, such as an area somewhat around wherever it was that we captured our packets in the first place, reasonably thinking that the people might not be too far from where they usually are, from where they live, from where they conduct all their business, we can potentially get even more answers. In the future, I might like to try and expand to do more queries based on other positively identified locations for each given profile, but that's for later. All right, so what can we do with this information? We can determine with some confidence for some SSIDs the latitude and longitude that they exist at, and also the address through the latitude and longitude, the network encryption type, and the first and last time that the network was seen. So all of this is kind of interesting information, but until we actually put it all together into something, it's all just kind of disparate sources of information. So how about we go ahead and put it all together? So just to summarize, we're able to generate a list of devices and the SSIDs that they've connected to, assuming they're not attempting to protect themselves from this kind of information disclosure. We can use the known SSIDs, or SSIDs that we've identified as belonging to various companies or whatever, to determine some behaviors about the people using the devices. And we can also use wiggle.net to attempt to locate and identify even more networks. So this is the display of the report that my tool builds. So at the top you can see it spits out the device ID, which is the burnt-in MAC address of the device, at least as far as as far as my tool is concerned. The manufacturer of the device, if we can identify the OUI prefix of the MAC address, the number of networks that the device is searching for, the number of networks that we've located, and this will continue scrolling off to the right, but this is just a screenshot. A few identified behavioral profile access points. So for this person, we can see that they have connected to AT&T Wi-Fi networks. Maybe they're an AT&T customer. Maybe they're also an Xfinity customer. Apparently, they've been to a Hilton hotel, sometime eventually. So that's okay. I'll get into that in a second. And then we can also see a list of the networks that we were able to locate, and the latitude and longitude and addresses that are associated with them, in addition to a little Google Maps picture in case you happen to be familiar with the area that you're looking at. So you can see, even from this very first one, there is a little bit of float with Wiggle's database. It doesn't always give you locations that are right on the money. You can see Granite City Guest is over here on Windsor. I don't actually know if there's Granite City over in Windsor, but I know there's one by the Rensen, and that's not too far from where this is identified. So it's possible that that's a little off. But you can get pretty good ideas of where these are specifically, and certainly with some of these, you might be able to, with a little bit of Googling, identify concrete addresses based on the, general location and the name of the network that you might be able to tie with a business or whatever. All right, so limitations. So this is able to provide us locations, but unfortunately it's not really able to provide us with a timeline except for the first seen and last seen date as provided by Wiggle. It's certainly possible, especially now that devices appear to be, saving their Wi-Fi network history across multiple devices, that somebody may have visited one of these networks anytime, within years, and the device would still have the network saved. And it would still be sending out these probe requests even though they hadn't visited it in some time. Additionally, we are only conducting passive collection at this time. So we are taking advantage only of devices that have not taken efforts to obscure the details of what they're attempting to connect to, either by randomizing the MAC addresses from their probe requests or sending only broadcast probe requests and forcing the access point to advertise itself to the client. It is certainly possible to take some active measures in order to kind of suss this information out from client devices. There is an attack that I've read about called beacon honeypotting, where essentially you advertise a network that you think that devices may have connected to, and then wait for them to attempt to associate with you. And if a device does so, then you can determine what the burnt-in MAC address of the device is, because the device needs to use the burnt-in MAC address in order to associate with the network. And also you can determine that it is apparently attempting to connect to this network, usually because it's attempted to connect to it before. Additionally, Wiggle's database is great, especially because, it's really the only one that lets me query by the parameters that I need to in order to get this to actually spit out useful information. But there are a lot of gaps, and mainly that's because it's a community-run database, which means that it's all collected by volunteers, which means that there are huge spaces all over the world that have either A, never been covered at all, or B, haven't been covered in years, leading to a lot of old, crusty data, which is potentially, not very useful if you're attempting to do solid identification of locations. So when I originally wrote this and brought this to my team, just kind of as a proof of concept, it was exactly that, just a proof of concept. I knew this was possible, and I kind of just wanted to put something together myself. Certainly, it seemed to have applications for surveillance type activities, but that's not really what we do. We do penetration testing and stuff. So, talking over with my team, we did determine a few potential attack scenarios that you might be able to use this for. The first one being using it to build phishing pretexts. So, the ideal collection environment for this would be, an office park separated from other office parks by wide open spaces like a parking lot, and a building that only had one company in it, because unfortunately we can't really do a whole lot to trim out devices that might belong to other companies, other people that we don't want to target. Certainly you might be able to do whitelisting on devices that only attempt to connect to whatever corporate deployment you're going against, but I don't know, especially with varying degrees of rules applied to BYOD situations or whatever else, you never know if you're going to be able to actually confirm that that's the case until you actually start digging around. So if you're able to collect enough information from devices that aren't already associated with the client's Wi-Fi deployment, and you're able to identify maybe a local diner or something, or restaurant, whatever, that many people have connected to, maybe you could attempt to build some kind of phishing pretext based off of the company's widespread clientele of this business. Personally, I'm a little fuzzy on this one. It seems to me like it could go into the spam folder really easily, but maybe some of you guys are a little bit craftier with setting up your phishing stuff than I am. Because the second one is a little bit over the line, in my opinion, especially given the fact that we can't be as confident as I think we'd like to be about the exact locations that we're getting from Wiggle for these various networks. So again, ideal place to collect would be an isolated office where we're not going to get any cross-contamination of devices that don't belong to company employees. We could analyze the profiles that we get generated and try and suss out corporate networks, or networks that aren't at residences from networks that were, and then attempt to go around to those residential addresses, verify that the device associated with the profile, the Burnton MAC address that is around that address, and then get out your directional antenna, attempts to de-authenticate them from their home network, authenticate them with your network, and then do whatever local attacks that you might do if you were on a privileged place in the network in order to gain interesting information about their devices. So I don't know about you guys, but usually the get out of jail free card only counts if you're on corporate property. I don't think it covers you hanging out in a van in front of someone's house. So I don't really know if this is within the realm of reasonable possibility, but it is another scenario that we came up with that could be used. So I do have a demo. Hopefully it goes okay. I have been collecting directed probe requests from you guys as we've been hanging out in the room here. So just wait for that to finish. Go ahead and generate those profiles, and we will open up to see what profiles have been generated from hanging out in this room. So at the moment, I'm just collecting this information through AeroDump. I'm just dumping it out to PCAP files and then analyzing those PCAP files. So I might at some point create some kind of a, interface inside of the tool itself to allow you to collect from an interface directly in there, but right now it's just kind of working that way. All right, so all of you guys appear to have well-patched, up-to-date devices, so I'm not getting too much information. But here we do have two profiles that were generated. One from an Apple device, appears to have connected previously to Courtyard Guest and H Honors wireless networks, and appears to belong to some kind of address up in Waterford Township. Additionally, we have another LG device looking for 11 networks. No networks were identified for behavioral profile information, but we do have a handful of addresses around Auburn Hills and Clarkston that I don't know. We'd have to Google them further to find out more information about them. None of these poke out as names that I'm intimately familiar with, but just kind of a demonstration of the tool itself and the information that it can gather dynamically. What's that? Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Apparently, this person goes to the Hoops Sports Bar in Auburn Hills, Michigan. So maybe that would be an interesting pretext to use for a phishing engagement. Maybe one of these other addresses is their house. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that right now. All right. So here we go. That's the quick demo there. So does anybody have any questions? Anything to say? Yes. So I hadn't heard about that tool. He was mentioning a tool called Linger that apparently collects these directed probe requests and then rebroadcasts them in order to make attempts like this more difficult to determine useful information from, which is actually pretty neat. Yeah, I know that there are a handful of companies, both in stores and also for various military applications, that create packages in order to try and take advantage of this. But no, I had not heard about that. Although it's kind of interesting that some implementations of the device obfuscation actually kind of achieve that on their own, in that they won't send randomized probe requests and only broadcast probe requests for every packet they send out. They'll still send directed probe requests, which actually, by the way, directed probe requests are sent for hidden wireless networks because that's kind of how they work. Hidden wireless networks need the client to attempt to locate the access point that they're trying to connect to. But I ran into an implementation earlier where it seemed like they were still sending directed probe requests for the networks that they were attempting to connect to, but they were changing the MAC address they were sending them from like every 10 minutes. So I had like 50 different profiles that were all duplicates because, I'm attempting to sort by unique MAC addresses sending out requests for various different networks. So, yeah, there are certainly a bunch of different ways that you can mess with people that are trying to do this, if you wanted to. But I hadn't heard of that tool. Thank you. Yeah. Sure. So, I mean, most fully up-to-date devices that I'm aware of attempt to protect their users from this by using those tactics that I mentioned. Certainly, as I mentioned, iOS since iOS 8, all the newest Android stuff. I think maybe Windows 10. I haven't done a full breakdown of all the different operating systems and what they do. But being able to take advantage of this kind of stuff is kind of going the way of the dinosaur as devices fall off. But yeah, that is an interesting kind of retransmission. Yo. So you can run queries based on a whole bunch of different parameters. For this I only have the SSID to search for, so that's all I'm using. But you can certainly use BSSIDs. SSID is, again, bound the search queries to specific areas. So that is actually one of the other features of the tool is, yes. Yeah. A flat file, .csv. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, you and I talked briefly about some of the stuff that you had been doing. Certainly, from the context that you're pulling from, where you have the Windows event logs, you can see the BSS ID of the network that they've connected to. So that allows you much better certainty of the actual device that the user is connecting to. So just moving over here, I have these are all the different profiles that were created, and yeah, you can see the database. The location, quote unquote, database is literally just a CSV file with null values associated for networks that I was not able to identify, and latitude and longitude points for networks that I was. So, all right. Sorry. As a matter of fact, that is my next slide. So, yeah, I pushed a very last update last night. So yeah, the link there will get you to the GitHub page that has the tool itself, and then also you can contact me through any of those other means if you want. Anyone else? All right, cool. Thanks for coming, everybody.